A few months back, I talked about what I considered to be one of the best, if not the single best piece of Scooby-Doo media with Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island. During the 90s, Scooby-Doo had a renaissance of sorts when Cartoon Network began running the old Scooby-Doo Where Are You cartoons. It became so popular that oftentimes it was their highest rated show, and even though the show was made for young children, the demographic watching it actually skewed older, which led to them making a more up-to-date and mature Scooby-Doo with Zombie Island. In 1999, Cartoon Network pitched the idea of having 3 separate Scooby-Doo marathons, with the last one culminating on Halloween. They took 3 animators, Chris Kelly, Larry Morris, and Steve Patrick, and asked each one to come up with a unique promo package for each marathon. During this time, a small indie film was beginning to pick up steam. The Blair Witch Project, a found footage horror film from Daniel Myrick and Eduardo Sanchez, was becoming something of a phenomenon, and yet it hadn't even been released. The 3 men decided right then and there that they should instead come together to create something they didn't think anyone else would, although they'd be dead wrong. They asked WB if they could create a parody of the soon-to-be-released horror film, and after shooting a proof-of-concept sequence showing Daphne running alone in the dark, they were given the green light. Now, for the uninitiated, or for those who were born after the fact, the Blair Witch Project was one of the earliest found footage horror films that claimed to be actual footage of the disappearance of 3 people. Blair Witch wasn't the first found footage horror film, but its success is really what propelled the genre into the limelight and would help launch even more successful ventures like the Paranormal Activity franchise. The Blair Witch Project was about 3 filmmakers who attempt to document the existence of a local Burkittsville, Maryland legend known as the Blair Witch. They would interview locals and explore the woods where the alleged sightings had occurred. Eventually, the 3 would disappear, and all that would be found is their cameras and what they recorded. The marketing behind the film was really what drove its popularity. The 3 main leads were considered to be deceased or missing. There were faux documentaries released about the legend and what may or may not have happened to those involved. It created quite the media firestorm, with people arguing over whether it really happened or not. When the movie finally released, it was a massive hit, becoming one of the most successful independent horror films of all time. And the perfect movie to turn into a Scooby-Doo parody. The idea was to create little intro and outro bumpers during the marathon that, when stitched together, would create one cohesive narrative, and because of how well they were received, would show again at the very end of the night in one completed edit. Production on the Scooby-Doo Project began in the summer of 1999, just prior to the release of the Blair Witch Project, and would last through to September. There was initial worry that by the time their parody would release, that no one would even remember what the Blair Witch Project was. But once the movie actually came out and they saw how popular or divisive it had become, that helped put some of those fears to rest. The crew were given a very small budget to work with, so they had to get very creative with how they would shoot their Halloween special. Often throughout the shoot, the crew would record improvised dialogue and voiceovers to help with the timing of the shots. This footage would then get redubbed with recordings from the actual voice actors, which they recorded over the phone. Since Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island had come out not too long before work on this had begun, they managed to get all the voice actors to return for this special. Scott Ines, Mary Kay Bergman, Frank Welker, and BJ Ward all returned for their respective roles. To film the scenes with the Mystery Machine, they flew down to Toronto, Canada, which at the time had the Mystery Machine, which was touring around doing promotional work for the WB. The vehicle just happened to be in Toronto when it came time to shoot those scenes, but it worked out well for them because flying down to Toronto to shoot these scenes was actually cheaper than if they had waited until it came back to the US. The bulk of this special would be filmed in Georgia at the childhood home of one of the animators. His parents allowed him to use the home to shoot the exterior mockumentary footage, and all the footage of the woods was shot in the backyard. The crew would arrive after work hours and begin building the tent in the backyard, which would be used in the halfway mark of this special. They also shot inside the home, using the upstairs as the perfect spot to film a classic Scooby-Doo chase sequence. Even better, the house had a very creepy cellar, which was used to perfectly mimic the ending of the Blair Witch Project. Now that we know most of the ins and outs of how this whole thing came to be, let's take a closer look and see just how well the Scooby-Doo Project was able to capture the look and vibe of one of horror's most divisive hits. Prior to the night of its airing, a promo was first released, made up to look like a press conference was being held about the found missing footage, when it's really just to promote the event itself. The promo was shot during a normal work day in a conference room by the cafeteria and had various employees filling in as reporters, including a programming executive standing in as a deputy.
We'll be showing them in a marathon type situation.
What about the whereabouts of the kids? Where are the kids?
I can't discuss that at this time. You'll just have to watch the marathon. No more questions.
Hey, excuse me, over here. Where are the kids? The public has a right to know.
Were there animals in the van?
The special begins with a similar intro to the Blair Witch, claiming the gang has went missing while investigating one of their many cases. It then cuts to the beginning of the found footage as Velma introduces the gang.
And that's Norville Rogers.
It's Shaggy!
The first thing that I'd like to point out is the 2D animation against the real life footage is genius and only gets better as the special progresses. The gang interviews folks who have claimed to see whatever this monster is that the gang appears to be in search of. One of the townsfolk even being a mother to one of the animators. Things don't seem to be making sense though, as each person has given a completely different account of what they believe they've seen. One guy even sounding a lot like a certain FBI agent.
Aliens, bioengineering, genetic mutations.
The special isn't just a parody of the Blair Witch Project, but also the cartoon itself. They break the fourth wall when they interview a guy who claims to know them as the gang from the cartoon that solve all the spooky mysteries.
Those woods are cursed! I never go near them! Like I bet she never goes near a dentist either!
While filming for this special, the crew would use markers made of paper and cardboard, and you can briefly see one here as they drive into the woods.
Things just look more realistic. Realistic.
The gang leave the safety of the mystery machine and head into the woods to investigate further. To help capture the look and feel of the movie, they decided to use the dual camera setup like in the film, even going as far as adding 16mm film grain effects to the black and white footage to more closely replicate it. The gang makes it to the cemetery where some supposed curse began. Velma attempts to explain the legend, but Scooby and Shaggy are way too scared to hear about it.
Okay, now we're trying to put the tent up before it gets too dark.
The gang set up a tent for the night to continue with the investigation, despite protests from, you guessed it, Scooby and Shaggy. Inside the tent, the gang are all falling over one another. This sequence was one of the more difficult ones to achieve. While filming, the crew would stand in for the characters, so when it came time for animation, the animators would know how to properly light Scooby and the others. Velma then tells a scary story, which just turns out to be one of the cases they all worked on.
Huh? What is that?
Let's split up and check it out. No way, Jose!
That night, they're all awakened by some ungodly sounds coming from outside their tent, and something seems to be attempting to come inside, perfectly capturing a similar scene from the Blair Witch. Outside the tent, Daphne discovers what she believes to be Scooby snacks, but the real horror sets in when Scooby and Shaggy discover that they're stale. The following morning, more Scooby snacks are left outside in piles, just like the rocks from Blair Witch. Scooby decides to take some, and they seem perfectly fine. One of the crew members was the one grabbing the Scooby snacks. They just animated Scooby's paw over his hand.
My feet hurt. Well, is it our fault you wore high heels on a hiking trip? At least I try to look feminine.
The gang starts to argue amongst themselves as the paranoia begins to set in, and Velma and Daphne have one of the funniest interactions in the special. Now lost, Velma looks over the map, but seems to be confused as to their current location. It's no surprise given how detailed the map is, something even Shaggy calls out.
Like, how can you read this map? It's just a dotted line and an X!
Velma and Fred argue because the map has now gone missing, and it turns out Scooby and Shaggy ate it with a little Tabasco sauce. That night, the gang continues to look for the mystery machine when Velma questions why Fred is always the one that gets to drive. Velma then tells them to wait up for her as she's lost her glasses, a staple trope of the Scooby Doo cartoons.
Zoinks! We're never gonna get out of here!
Zoinks? That's all you have to say, zoinks? What the heck does that mean anyway?
The gang are really now coming at one another, even mocking their own popular catchphrases. Scooby then suddenly goes missing, until he's found. The next morning, Fred finds a clue which turns out to be the gang's footprints. I think it's simply genius that they would animate the footprints like they were from the cartoon, and when Scooby and Shaggy are both on screen, having Shaggy blurry in the foreground while focusing on Scooby is a brilliant touch. For what is just supposed to be a cheap bumper reel during a Halloween marathon, they really went out of their way to make it feel special.
Just
Just remain calm.
You remain calm.
I am calm. You're the ones that aren't calm.
I'm calmer than you.
I'm always calm, man. I'm the calm one. I'm calm.
The gang is now just walking in circles and losing their minds. Fred Jones' completely breaking character is hilarious. That night, they continue their trek when they catch something running in the woods. Velma does some sleuthing around their tent and discovers something has eaten all of their food, which just turns out to be Scooby. A familiar voice is then heard, which sends the gang running off screaming in terror. This scene of Daphne running is the proof of concept they used to get the special greenlit in the first place.
It's just Scrappy-Doo! I know!
I love how even the people putting this together know that no one likes Scrappy-Doo. Even with a monster on the loose, they're more afraid of Scrappy-Doo. Scrappy finally does find them, but when they hear the monster off in the distance, Scrappy takes off after it and the gang sort of just lets him go and they ditch him. The gang find a house in the middle of the woods, and instead of listening to Shaggy, they decide to go in.
Like, oh no, not music. We always get chased when there's music.
In classic Scooby-Doo fashion, you can't have a chase scene without some cheesy pop music. This entire section was one of the hardest to animate because they couldn't use trackers here. Instead, the animators had to painstakingly go frame by frame and animate each motion. Velma gets chased into the basement where she finds Shaggy staring at the wall.
Shaggy, what are you doing in the corner?
I'm scared, man. Like scared.
If you had watched the bumpers as they aired, this is where it originally ended. But when they showed the special as one full thing later on in the night, they tacked on another ending so as not to scare the younger viewers. Instead, the gang captures the monster, who turns out to be some guy who, like Sheriff Brackett, just wanted to give one good scare on Halloween. Although the special still ends with an ambiguous ending anyways, where the gang is presumed missing. A year later, a bumper was shown during the Cartoon Network halftime show that took place during the Super Bowl. This bumper was supposed to be a technical issue that was showing a live feed from behind the scenes where Fred is having a conversation with Moltar from Space Ghost Coast to Coast and tells him they escaped the monster and discovered he was yet another guy in a mask.
Right.
And you're lost.
Uh-huh.
And you're taping it.
Yep.
And they said it was just another tired rip-off of the Blair Witch Project?
I know.
Man, that hurts.
Tell me about it.
When the special aired, it was a big hit. The creators were worried no one would care as many, and I mean many, spoofs of the Blair Witch Project were coming out at the time. But of all the spoofs to come out that year, the Scooby Doo Project is often cited as being the best. Despite its acclaim, which included winning an Annie Award for Outstanding Animated Project, the special has never really had a release. It could be found on some Best of Cartoon Network DVDs, but those are long out of print and really hard to find. There's some speculation that because Scooby-Doo started going down a more kid-friendly route, that there really wasn't a demand to have a release for it. The special was such a success that they released a quasi-sequel the following year called Night of the Living Doo.
And to cap it off, on Halloween, we've got a 24-hour marathon of Scooby-Doo called Night of the Living Doo! With new special guests like David Cross, Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, and an undead Gary Coleman!
That one didn't age quite so well.
Unfortunately, it was done more like a standard episode of the classic show and had nothing to do with the movie Night of the Living Dead, which was a big disappointment. A one-to-one parody of Night of the Living Dead would have been amazing. Hell, let's get crazy and start doing more parodies of classic horror films. I would kill for a Halloween or Friday the 13th parody. I'm really glad that someone I used to know brought this little special to my attention. I had no idea of its existence until a few months ago, and after watching it, I knew I had to make a video about it. You don't have to be a fan of the Blair Witch Project, or even like it in order to have fun with this one. It does have some fun fourth wall breaking, makes fun of the Blair Witch and Scooby-Doo in general. It's a little spookier than the average Scooby-Doo episode, so some younger kids might get scared, but it's silly and there's nothing bad in it. If you want to see the special in its entirety, there are a lot of fan uploads. Cartoon Network uploaded their own version, but it's missing a lot of the footage. I'll leave a link to what I think is the best version in the description, so you can go watch it if you so desire. Anyways, that's all for today, but if you'd like to see my video on Scooby-Doo on Zombie Island, well, you can check that out right here. Thank you so much for watching, and stay spooky.
I lost my glasses.
Here we go again.
Velma, for crying out loud! A glasses strap? How many times have we told you? A glasses strap!